Hi, this is Maggie from Crafts the Charm. Thank you for stopping by my channel. I'm so glad you're here. And today I really want to make a coastal table runner out of some old jeans. And I got this idea from a rug listing that I saw on Facebook Marketplace. So the design is inspired by that rug. And I put out among my friends that if anybody had old jeans that they couldn't donate, if they could drop them off to me, I would love to use them for crafting. And I have a wonderful friend who's given me a number of pairs of jeans. I've also found some on Facebook Marketplace, and I've gotten them there as well. So to start, I am just going to take these jeans and I'm going to press them, and then I'm going to cut strips out of the legs. And I'm making it easy on myself here. I'm just cutting the seams away. And then with the leg that I have after I do that, I'm going to cut strips using my rotary cutter. And I'm cutting strips in two different widths. I'm cutting strips that are 1/4 inch, and I'm also going to cut some strips that are 3/4 of an inch. And when I worked on this project, I did cut some of those 3/4 inch strips in half. The size of the strip isn't that important, but I think you will have more control over the design if you use smaller strips. But I also liked being able to switch between the strips to give me some variation in the design. And you can see too that I'm using two different pairs of jeans here, and I'm using two different colors. So I'm using a dark blue and I'm using a light blue. And again, for the variation in this project, I like having those two different colors. Now I believe I used one leg from each pair of jeans for this project, and I didn't use up all of the strips that I had. Now it's possible I only used one side of one leg for one of the colors, but I think I used two sides of two legs. The reason I'm not sure is because I tried 3 different ways to get the look that I wanted, and of course I'm going to show you the final way, which I think worked best. That's why this channel is called Crafts the Charm. Quite often the third time is the charm when I'm trying to figure out how to do something. Now for the base of this table runner, I'm trying to keep the cost down. So I'm going to use this 8-ounce canvas drop cloth, which is 9 feet by 12 feet. I got this on Amazon, and I'll include a link in the description. And I've used this for several projects. It's a lot of fabric that is inexpensive, and it's nice, sturdy fabric. The disadvantage to this fabric is I'm not crazy about the color of it, but we're going to be covering it up so you won't see the color, and it does tend to fray. So my final table runner is approximately 5 feet or 60 inches by a little more than 12 inches wide, and I probably should have been a little more careful when I cut this, but if you want to make one that is as a finished size 60 inches by 12 inches, then I recommend you cut this 61 inches by 13 inches and have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just going to press this, cut it down roughly to size, press it again, and do a final cut because I do want it to be nice and straight. And with this drop cloth, it does have seams in it, so I had to make sure I cut it in a place where I had a 5-foot length without a seam. With that cut now, I'm pressing over a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you can see I'm only folding that over once. That's because I wanted to avoid bulk on the edges. But because this does fray, that may not have been the best choice because it is fraying a little bit on the bottom. That's what I did. I would recommend folding it over twice, possibly even doing a wider seam allowance, and then maybe it wouldn't feel quite so bulky on the edges. And then I just sewed around that on my sewing machine. And then I pressed it again. Now our pattern is going to be 6-inch squares over the entire table runner. So there are going to be 20 squares which are 6 by 6 inches. And what I'm doing is just folding it in half to find the center, and there will be one 6-inch square on either side of the center. So I'm just marking that with a pencil, and then I'm just marking those center 6-inch squares. The reason I started at the center is I wasn't sure if I was going to do an overall pattern of all 6-inch squares, or if I might do a pattern of 6-inch squares, 2, alternating with 3 4-inch squares. So I just started in the middle. Now I'm going to put a border around each of my squares, which is made of braided jute twine. I got this jute twine at the Dollar Tree. I'm sure you can get it anywhere. The sizes that I used is I measured 27-inch lengths to go around the outside of the square. They probably don't have to be quite 27 inches. I wanted to make sure they were long enough. Obviously, if we measure the perimeter of the square, it would be 24 inches because it's 6 by 6 by 6 by 6. But because we're braiding and bending it at the corners, it's not going to be exactly 24. We'll need a little bit more. And we are going to use some of those leftover ends of the braids. So I just cut 3 lengths, 27 inches each, and I found it helpful to tape it down while I was braiding it, and then I taped the other end as well. Now I'm going to stitch these squares onto the table runner, the drop cloth part, but I don't want to stitch them a lot. I just want to stitch basically an X through each square. So I thought I would try something I haven't used before, which is this double-sided fabric tape. This one is 1/4 inch wide, and I got this on Amazon. I'll include a link in the description. Now, of course, the danger with this is it's going to make everything sticky if you try to sew through it. It's going to make your sewing machine needle sticky, and I really didn't want to do that. So I tried to be careful with the tape not to put it on the diagonal where I plan to sew. So I'm going to put this down to hold the pieces in place a little bit while I'm putting a square together, and I'm going to do one square at a time and then sew. Now, near the end of the project, I found it was a lot easier to affix these pieces if I did put more tape down. So I put more tape down near the end of the project, but it did make my sewing machine needle sticky. What I decided was I'm probably going to discard this needle anyway. I've done a lot of sewing with it, and it's probably time for a new needle anyway. So you take this tape, and I'm putting it down, avoiding the corners, and then I'm just pressing my braid onto the tape. And I'm doing this outside in because we have a little bit more of a fudge factor near the middle of this. It's a little bit hard to fold in the center so that you end up with a square. It's much easier to start at the outside. My next layer is going to be one of my 1/4 inch strips of the jeans fabric. And what I'm doing at the corners is sort of folding it over so that I get a 90-degree angle, a square corner. The next layer is then going to be another braid of the jute. These I cut to 25 inches, and that was actually probably quite a bit longer than I needed. Again, I am going to be using those pieces at the end to fill in empty spaces, you will see. But I did another braid, and that's the next layer on the inside. Now, inside that, the bulk of the square is just going to be jeans. So we're going to go all the way to the center with the jeans fabric, just folding it at the corners. And what I did was I tried to have variation in the colors that I chose. So here I'm using just the light blue. and I'm using the 1/4 inch. But on the final table runner, you can see I alternated using dark blue and light blue. I sometimes did a dark blue border with light blue inside. Occasionally, maybe 4 squares, I used a little bit of the 3/4 inch. It's easier and quicker to put down, but I don't like the way it looks as much as the smaller pieces. But I did think it offered some nice variation occasionally in the squares. And you can't really do this randomly. You have to mix them up in a way that you think looks nice. So once I had that one square put together, I sewed diagonal to diagonal on my sewing machine. And my advice here is to do this very slowly and use something to make sure those folds go properly underneath the sewing machine's foot. You can see here I'm using my tiny scissors. It's very helpful when sewing this to press your pieces down before you go to the sewing machine. This will just make it a little bit easier to sew them flat. Once I had sewn those corner to corner, I cut off those edges of the braid, and any one that's longer than, say, 2 inches, I saved. Again, we're going to use those later. Now here's the project I've done, the 4 middle pieces, and you can see there's a little bit of variation there in what I've done with the squares. And now I'm just going to measure off the rest of the table runner. Again, I had thought maybe I would do 3 4-inch squares next to the 2 6-inch squares, but I decided I would rather just do 6-inch squares over the whole piece. And because I didn't plan very well, my edge pieces on each end are a little bit shorter than 6 inches each. This is another reason to start in the middle in case you haven't measured well and your end pieces end up a little bit larger or smaller than the other ones. Now in some places, particularly where I didn't use very much of that tape, there are pieces that aren't held down the way they should be. So what I'm going to do is use just a little dot of Aleen's fabric glue here and there where the pieces aren't lying flat. Now with all of my squares sewn on, I have these little diamonds in the corners of the squares. And what I did was I put tape in those little diamonds, and then I took some of my leftover pieces of braid and I sort of put them into the diamond in almost a spiral, and then I stitched them down. Now in retrospect, I would just sew these down by hand. I would not use this tape because I ended up having to sew them all down by hand anyway. I'm not sure why my sewing machine would not sew these down if it's because of the thread I was using or if because my needle had become so sticky, but I had to sew all of these down by hand anyway, and that's much easier to do without this tape there. So I could do some on the sewing machine, but then my sewing machine balked. Now I want to put a braided border around the entire piece. So I'm just figuring out how long that piece of jute is going to have to be and then adding about a foot to it. So if this is 60 inches, it's going to be 120 for the two lengths. And then for the width, if it's 12 inches, add another 24, so 148. And then I added again about another foot to account for the braiding. Maybe I added another 2 feet now that I'm looking at myself doing it. So then I just measured out the 3 pieces of jute for this braid. And what I did was I just clipped it to the corner of this piece. And then I wound up each of the 3 pieces around my hand and clipped them to make it a little bit easier to braid with them. And then as I went around the piece, I clipped the braid to the piece and unclipped each of the 3 pieces of jute to give myself a little bit more length, and then continued to braid. And this I did sew by hand because I had so much difficulty with the pieces in the middle, and this is quite easy to sew and it doesn't take very long. So just a straight stitch. Now to finish it at the end, I'm coming around to where I initially clipped it when I started this. And because there's a little space there at the corner, what I ended up doing was bringing that initial braid around onto the end and bringing the new braid around the other side. And I just braided it as far as I could and then trimmed it off and then just sewed it down really carefully. And then again on the other side of this end, there was some white showing. So I just took another piece of braid that I had cut off from one of my squares and I sewed that onto the other end. And basically at the ends of these, I just sewed around the end to hold it down onto the piece. So just looped around it to hold those ends tight so they don't fray. And here it is. Here it is on my dining room table. And here's a little bit of a closer view. I would love to know what you think, or if you have a different idea for how you would do this. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoy this sort of content, please subscribe to Crafts the Charm. Thank you for spending time with me today. Take care.